I feel like the reason why Star Wars, especially the original trilogy, is so great is because of all the random monsters that you see throughout the movies that actually contribute to the plot. It leaves people that see these movies wanting to know more about the background of these characters, why they're there, what they are, and that is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. This is the Star Wars Monster Iceberg. At the top you have much more well-known creatures such as the Sarlacc Pit, the Rancor, the Wampa, or that space slug thing. And then as we get further down we get into some much more obscure lore such as the Vader monsters, the Gorax, the Black Wing Virus, Abeloth, and a lot more random creatures that will make you become more obsessed with Star Wars than you already were. I know I am now. But if you like Star Wars or you just like monsters in general, then sit back, relax, and we will go ahead and get into this video. Starting off at the top of this iceberg with tier 1, we have the Sarlacc Pit. So I'm sure everybody knows the Sarlacc Pit. It is that gaping hole in the ground with teeth, and then in the newer versions it's got tentacles and a beak even, that we see in Return of the Jedi that Jabba the Hutt takes his enemies to be executed by being fed to this thing. This creature is a dangerous carnivore that is on the planet Tatooine and many others throughout the galaxy. One thing I found really interesting about it is it's not, this mouth thing sticking out of the ground, but rather there is a huge full body all the way underneath the ground that's like 330 feet deep. And it's supposed to have like these roots that stick into the ground and actually suck up nutrients. And it has this additional lore about how it has this interesting lifestyle where it lives for a really long time, and like the one we saw in the movie was supposed to be like 30,000 years old. But whenever they reach maturity, they burrow down into the ground and then stick out these like tendrils to anchor themselves. And it's kind of like a root system on a tree where they wait for prey to just fall into them rather than, moving around to hunt, which younger Sarlaccs are said to actually do. They run around on the ground and they just terrorize people. They're actually a huge threat. But the Sarlacc we see in Return of the Jedi is actually a specific one named the Almighty Sarlacc, or the Sarlacc of Carkoon. This one actually has a backstory about how it floated through space for like a really long time and just so happened to land on the planet Tatooine. But whenever it landed there, the planet was actually like a lush rainforest. And so it went into hibernation long enough to where it woke up and is now in this desert climate like we see in the movies. Although most Sarlaccs usually eat flesh from animals and stuff like that, this one was said to not actually eat flesh. It preferred vegetation and especially did not want to eat sentient beings. But as the years went on, people like Jabba the Hutt found it and started to force feed it. And what's really morbid about this is because this is a giant flesh pit that, might go a really long time between meals, whenever living beings fall into it, it has to try to keep it alive to eat later. And that could be like hundreds of years. This thing is said to have these tentacles that sting things that fall into it to be paralyzed so that it makes them easier to keep at bay. And basically, people will be inside of its body, like consciously knowing what's going on for it could be hundreds of years, or even, thousands to hundreds of thousands of years. And what's really interesting about this process of keeping people alive inside of there, or sentient beings alive, is that it was said to separate the sentient creatures from the non-sentient ones, and somehow be able to keep people's minds thinking and still processing even while they're still being dissolved inside of this creature's stomach. What's crazier is these people's consciousness in the Sarlacc will slowly merge with this hive mind beast. And so basically this Sarlacc, that we see in the movie may have somehow telepathically known that Luke was a Jedi. Because if it is a hive mind and, it has other people's minds from the past, maybe other Jedi or Force-sensitive people fell in there and it could sense that Luke was there and maybe it tried not to eat him, or maybe it even influenced everybody to be bad at shooting whenever they were trying to fight back, you know. But anyways, whenever Boba Fett falls in, it's said that his Mandalorian armor kept him from being stung by the toxins that paralyzed him, and that's how he was able to get out. That's like the background lore. I personally love the depictions of the Sarlacc Pit in the Force Unleashed video games, if you guys have ever played those. But in that game, you have like this huge battle on top of a Sarlacc, and it's trying to hit you with its tentacles, and you can even go inside of it at one point in the game. There's kind of some lore in the game about how the Felucian people on the planet Felucia had called this Sarlacc there the Ancient Abyss because it would eat like entire Rancors and stuff. And so while the Empire was hunting down the Felucian people, they climbed down inside of the Sarlacc and started living in it so that the Empire wouldn't find them. And so the Empire then tortured this Sarlacc, which, keep in mind, some people think they're like, which I guess I should have said this earlier, but Sarlaccs are like psychic to some point from what some people say. So they can like communicate with their mind, and so like if you were a force sensitive individual, you would be feeling extreme despair from what the Sarlacc was feeling. And anyways, I went on way too long about that. Normally these topics are not going to take this long, but these first few are just like there's a lot more lore about the really well-known ones than the others. So moving on, we have the Rancor Monster. So the Rancor was that monster that we saw in Return of the Jedi again, where Luke fell through the trapdoor and was supposed to get fed to this monster beneath Jabba's palace. Rancors are these reptile mammal hybrids that come from the planet Dathomir. They're roughly 16 to 20 feet tall. They have these long arms and just look extremely dangerous. Normally, they're about over 3,000 pounds, and they have this massive mouth full of serrated teeth, and they are specialized predators that sit at the top of basically any food chain on any environment that they inhabit. Now, although they are known for their incredible physical strength, they surprisingly have a capacity for deep emotional bonding with those who train them. And so that's kind of the background lore to why we see the trainer in Jabba's palace crying after Luke slays the Rancor. That guy was his handler, and there's actually some background information about how he was planning to betray Jabba and run away with the Rancor because Jabba was planning on fighting a Krayt Dragon against this Rancor, and he would not have won at all. So he was just about to escape, and then Luke gets there and just kills it, and so that's so sad. On the planet Dathomir, where they come from, the Night Sisters famously tamed these things and even rode them into battle like horses. And there was also a couple strange subspecies of this creature, like the Bull Rancor and the Flying Rancor. The Bull Rancor was much larger. It was a more aggressive variant found on Felucia. It was distinguished by its pale, almost translucent skin and massive protruding horns that it used for territorial display in crushing prey. The Flying Rancor was this ancient force-sensitive predator from the planet Tython that the Rakatan Empire actually genetically engineered to have these leathery wings and to serve as aerial shock troopers for their military. Next up on this list, we have the Wampa. So the Wampa is my personal favorite of probably all these monsters on this list. If you remember in the best Star Wars movie, The Empire Strikes Back, Luke is riding his Tauntaun out on the planet Hoth when he gets attacked by this giant Yeti looking thing. That is what the Wampa is. It's that Yeti thing from Hoth. They are large, 10 foot tall. They can be 440 pounds. And they're not quite apex predators, as there was also this like fire breathing dragon slug that would actually hunt the Wampa, which is kind of crazy. But the Wampa would run around on 4 legs using their white polar bear fur as camouflage, and then they would jump out and ambush their prey, trying to stun it so that they could bring it back to their cave to preserve it for longer. I don't know about you, but I always wondered, how did the Wampa hang Luke from the ceiling? Well, part of the lore is that the Wampa has this thick saliva that it just basically licked onto his feet and stuck him into the ceiling. What I found interesting about the Wampa is that they actually live in a group in their caves, and they're very protective of the members of their group. And so part of the lore in The Empire Strikes Back is that the Wampas lived in the area that the rebel base was. They lived in those caves, and the rebels actually forced them out. And so there's actually a deleted scene where the Wampas come back and end up attacking the base, and they cause all this chaos amidst the Empire invasion. I really like it, of course, because it looks like a mythical creature, you know, the Yeti from the Himalayas, or the abominable snowman. Of course, you know, if you've ever played the wonderful game Star Wars Shadows of the Empire, the Wampas were actually trapped in jail cells, and you could unlock them and then have them go out and attack the stormtroopers for you. Also in the game Jedi Fallen Order, there is this creature that's like a cousin to the Wampa called the Mogu, and it's pretty much just like a warmer climate version of the Wampa. What I feel like a lot of people don't know is the reason why they even included this whole Wampa attack scene is because the guy who played Luke Skywalker, Mark Hamill, had gotten in a really bad car accident, and he had some pretty noticeable face scars on him. And so they needed to explain that in the story because it was so prominent. And so the way they did that was by saying that he had gotten attacked by a creature, and then they just went on with the story. So that's actually kind of cool. It's good that they could continue the story and he wasn't hurt that bad. 2. Car crash equals Wampa. Pretty epic. Sorry, Mark Hamill. Alright, next up we have the Krayt Dragon. So the Krayt Dragon is the undisputed apex predator on Tatooine. You probably remember it from the Mandalorian show where they end up having a huge battle with the Krayt Dragon at one point. But it is this massive carnivorous reptile that absolutely dominates the planet's harshest environments. This species is actually divided into multiple subspecies, such as the smaller canyon krait, which inhabits the rocky bluffs, and I believe that the Tusken Raiders would hunt these as a rite of passage, and then the much larger greater krait, which is so big, it's large enough to move through the sand like, you know, the sandworm Shai-Hulud from Dune, as if it's swimming through water. So in the Mandalorian show, we don't get like the greatest view of the full body of the creature, but this design that you don't see, but they have shown the design off screen, is supposed to have 16 legs. I thought that was really interesting. I thought this artwork was really cool of it. I like that in the show they had it spitting, you know, concentrated acidic bile that can melt through solid rock. And also, if you pay attention in the original trilogy, Obi-Wan Kenobi does this really like crazy howl at one point that scares away the Tusken Raiders, and that is supposed to be the Krayt Dragon howl. They're actually the only known predators of the Sarlacc Pit, and these reptiles never stop growing, and they don't even die when they get old. They have to be killed by something else to die. To a lot of local Tusken Raiders, the Krayt Dragon was actually a godlike figure, and so they had a lot of reverence for the greater Krayt Dragon. One interesting thing I liked about this thing is that it eats rocks to help with digestion, just like birds do in real life. And so those rocks would actually get polished by the intense pressure in their stomachs and would heat into these Krayt Dragon pearls, which are these very expensive gems that you actually put into lightsabers, and they're very powerful focusing crystals that sometimes made this strange, eerie howling sound, kind of like the Krayt Dragon itself. The Sith Lord Darth Krayt, after Order 66, adopted the name of the creature as he was raised by Tusken Raiders on Tatooine, and so he actually had abandoned his Jedi identity to become this Darth Krayt and embrace the desert personality as, you know, an unstoppable hunter, which the Krayt Dragon was. Oh, and at the very beginning of Star Wars A New Hope, the first ever Star Wars movie, you can see this skeleton when C-3PO is wandering through the sand dune desert on Tatooine, and it looks like this long skeleton that is so crazy. It's actually a Diplodocus sauropod dinosaur skeleton that George Lucas had gotten from the Disney film One of Our Dinosaurs is Missing, 1975. And so this is so crazy. They had got these bones from Disney, even whenever they weren't owned by Disney. And no joke, they didn't have enough budget to remove the bones from the desert. So they left this huge, obviously fake, skeleton of a dinosaur in these sand dunes. And so this fiberglass fake skeleton was left untouched for nearly 20 years after the movie was filmed. Like, even whenever they went back to film the prequel trilogy, the bones were still there, which is just so crazy. Now we are on tier 2 with the trash monster. So I'm sure at one point you have asked yourself, why is there a giant monster on the Death Star in their trash compactor? You know, in that scene in A New Hope, Luke was dragged down by a big tentacle on the Death Star in the trash room. That tentacle thing is actually called a Dianoga. This is a large aquatic cephalopod-like creature that can grow up to 30 feet long. It had 7 tentacles, this sharp mouth that it used for grabbing and tearing food, and 1 eye that was on a stalk that could pop up out of the water and then search around for prey. Originally, these things came from the planet Vodran, and then eventually spread across the galaxy by hiding in garbage ships, which is why they were often found in trash compactors and sewers and waste systems. Even tiny ones ended up in toilets sometimes in the lore. Poop squid. As for why one specifically was on the Death Star, apparently, I don't know if this is 100% canon, but the Empire purposefully put creatures in the trash compactor as biological waste disposal systems in case there was some sort of organic matter that fell into the trash, or if like a person was hiding in the trash compactor, so it did exactly its job whenever they fell into the trash. So pretty much these things were like a security system, and it's even said that the creatures were maybe sentient and could sometimes sense force-sensitive creatures. So some people think that the reason why Luke was grabbed by the Dianoga instead of anybody else was because he was force-sensitive and the Dianoga knew that he was going to become a Jedi. These things were also said to have some like tribal culture where they did this deep humming language and could communicate underwater, and they saw the water as something sacred. They called it the Great Cleanser, and they also believed in reincarnation. That's part of it too. But you could also see these creatures in the game Shadows of the Empire, like I talked about before, where Dash Rendar goes into a sewer and it's infested by Dianoga. Also, fun fact, Dexter Jetster served some Dianoga dishes in his diner. So, alright, this is a great one. Geonosis Arena Creatures. So in Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Padme all get captured and taken into the arena on Geonosis, where they plan to execute them with 3 different creatures. This arena was actually part of Geonosian culture, and it was a very violent culture that they had there. They had gladiators fight these beasts for entertainment, just like the Romans did. But it seems like they chose specific creatures for each of the characters. Padme's monster was the Nexu. The Nexu was this cat-like hunter from the planet Chalgana. It had these 4 eyes that helped with depth perception, but also it had infrared vision, so it could see body heat from people through things, or if they're trying to be camouflaged, you can just see their body heat. It also had these claws and quills on its back like a porcupine, but it had a weak skeletal structure, so that's why whenever Padme jumps off the beam and kicks this thing, it stuns it pretty bad and it can't move afterward because she hurt it. She hurted it. And then we have the Reek, which was Anakin's monster that he had to fight. It was a large rhinoceros-like creature from the planet Yelegia. It was heavily armored, had 3 horns. Normally, these creatures are supposed to be herbivores, but if they get starved, they will actually become extremely aggressive carnivores. And while their colors are normally like a gray, a brown, or a yellow, they would turn into this carnivore deep red color. And so that's what we see in the movie, a deep red rhinoceros monster thing that Anakin is having to fight. Finally, we have Obi-Wan's horrific creature, an Acklay. This thing is not a praying mantis, even though it looks like one. It's actually a crab/crustacean thing that is actually a reptile-like creature from the planet Vendaxa. This creature is semi-aquatic and normally lived underwater, but would come up on the land to hunt. If you think about what this thing is, it is just so deadly. It had these 6 deadly claw spikes that would thrust like a spear, and these razor-sharp teeth that could just bite through a lot of different things. If you look really close on what this thing's spike things actually were, they actually were on an elbow, and its feet were these hands that just had these modified big spikes that were just claws. So it was a big hand at the elbow with this finger sticking off. One giant finger. Big finger claw, that's what it had. The Naboo sea monsters. So in The Phantom Menace, episode 1 of Star Wars, we have that scene where Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon are traveling with Jar Jar from his Atlantis city to the city on Naboo. In this scene, we get a whole bunch of different aquatic monsters eating each other, and Qui-Gon's like, there's always a bigger fish, and it's true. The biggest fish we see in this scene is the Sando Aqua Monster. These things were so massive. They were like 650 feet long. They normally got to the age of like 100 years old. But apparently there's a comic where at one point Darth Vader just kills one of these things and it's like 900 years old. So I feel like he was doing too much at that point. But there was many myths and legends in the Naboo planet culture about these creatures and where they came from. And yeah, I'm not going to get too far into these monsters because, there's bigger fish to talk about. Moving on to the Mudhorn. So the Mudhorn is this shaggy rhino-looking creature from the 2nd episode of the Mandalorian show. To me, this thing looks extremely similar to a real-life extinct animal, the woolly rhinoceros, which lived during the Ice Age, and fun fact, it actually went extinct so recently that there is actually prehistoric people that saw it and did cave paintings of it that we have seen. I think more specifically though, this thing looks like the extinct creature Elasmotherium, which is even more similar to the way it looks. It had like a much larger horn, just like the Mudhorn in The Mandalorian. Anyways, the Star Wars creature, the Mudhorn, was fought by Din Djarin, or the Mandalorian, who fights it because he's trying to steal its egg to then give to the Jawas, because the Jawas just want to eat the egg. That's about it. They want to eat it. And so, ultimately, Grogu stops the woolly rhino, or the Mudhorn, by using the Force, and then Din Djarin takes a knife and slays the Mudhorn so that the Jawas can eat the very yummy egg. And that's about all of that. Tier 3, Ewoks ate people. So this is just true. This is referring to the fact that the Ewoks had captured Han, Luke, and Chewie, and they obviously were going to cook them alive. They had tied them up on sticks, and they were taking them over, and they started a fire underneath them until Luke uses the Force to trick them into thinking C-3PO was like a god. And even if you remember, Leia had been dressed in a dress that was exactly the same size as her, meaning that the Ewoks had probably captured another woman about Leia's size and ate her. So anyways, after the Battle of Endor, we see the Ewoks playing the drums on the stormtroopers' helmets. And where did those stormtroopers go? We don't see any prisoners. So, I mean, if they're going to eat the good guys when they're not doing anything wrong, surely they're going to eat the bad guys after a violent battle that they just had with them. If you've ever played the game Star Wars Battlefront 2, the more recent version of that game, there's a game mode called Ewok Hunt, and it's basically you are the Empire, everybody's the Empire, and there's only a few Ewoks, and it's kind of like an Infection style game where the Ewoks go and take out a stormtrooper, and then they become an Ewok. But the whole point of that game is that the Ewoks are eating the stormtroopers. Anyways, that's a sick game mode. They specifically hunt them at night because they have enhanced senses. They're better at hunting at night, which is like kind of nightmare fuel when you really think about it. A little further down we have the Rathtars. These are creatures that we see in The Force Awakens where Han Solo and Chewbacca show up for the first time, and they have captured and were smuggling these creatures called Rathtar. These are these large squid-like creatures that hunted in packs, and they were very dangerous, they were always aggressive, and they were basically blind. They just reached out with all these tentacles where they would just feel around to grab whatever it was so they could just eat it. They kind of lacked skeletons and they moved around like slugs. And in the movie, Finn mentions how these things caused the Trillia massacre, which apparently is saying that they had went out and just killed a lot of living creatures in some sort of horrific massacre. But it's left vague, I'm sure on purpose, so that we wonder what the heck happened. And there's no additional lore to that. We just hear that they did something bad at some point. Now we are on the Exogorth, or the space slug. So this is a creature from The Empire Strikes Back as well, where the Millennium Falcon accidentally flies into this cave on an asteroid, where they then realize that they are inside of a living creature. They then try to fly out really fast, where this creature lunges up from its cave and tries to bite them, but they get away. The lore behind this creature is probably the craziest of any of these monsters from the original trilogy, but it's really, really cool. There's a few really strange things about them, like they're huge, they're like half a mile long, they're over 1,000 feet, 900 meters. They oftentimes have entire ecosystems inside of them. Creatures called Minocs would live inside them, which are like these parasite things. What's really interesting about these creatures is how they move through space. They do this thing where they have these telescopic eyes that are constantly looking around in space trying to detect light from nearby stars, and if anything blocks that light for a second, they will jump off of their asteroids aimed at that point that blocked the light to hopefully float through space and reach whatever that thing was so it can eat it, which could be an extremely long time because, you know, space is big. Once they would find another asteroid, they would then burrow down inside of it and grow roots and start sucking up nutrients from the minerals in these rocks. But they would also position themselves so that they could lunge out and eat things that pass by, like other asteroids or ships or even other space creatures that are for some reason in the vacuum of space, but it makes sense it makes sense in Star Wars. It's different. Another thing I really like about them is they reproduce through fission, where at the base where they are attached to the asteroid, they will grow a complete another clone of themselves that is independent right away, and then it will jump off and continue the life cycle, eating other asteroids and ships and other space creatures. These are some of the longest living creatures in the Star Wars universe. The one that we see from the movie, specifically called Zillo, is said to be over 1 billion years old. I also read this cool thing about how at one point there was these evil scientists that were trying to weaponize these things, and they strapped hyperdrives to their backs, and they did this with like an entire herd of exogorths. And this swarm was so powerful that they could eat an entire star system in a matter of days. They tried to sell these things as super weapons to like different major factions, such as the Republic and the Mandalorians, but nobody wanted them because they're just such a horrifically dangerous threat. So in the end, they ended up taking all these hyperdrive souped up exogorths and they just sent them off drifting into wild space. So yeah, that's a huge, that's a big threat. Next we have ice spiders. Also known as knobby white spiders, these are the spider-like creatures that we see in the Mandalorian show on the planet Maldo Kreis. These are predatory spider-like creatures that were really tough. They were kind of like blaster resistant. They swarmed in these hives like we see in the Mandalorian episode, where they would attack if they were disturbed. And they do get disturbed because Grogu starts eating their eggs, which, you know, good for him. I don't blame him for eating spiders. These creatures had protruding mouths with fangs all around them, and in the expanded lore, they were native to the planet Dagobah, you know, the one where Yoda hid, and they actually weren't just spiders, but they were rather like trees that were mobile roots that would grow on a long tree and then break free and roam around, getting their nutrients from other things, and then eventually anchor back down, grow its legs into roots, and transform into another towering tree. So maybe these two species we see in The Mandalorian and in this expanded lore are two different like subspecies. But yeah, tree spider. Tier 4, the Mythosaur. So the Mythosaur, as you know, is the Mandalorian skull symbol. If you look at Boba Fett, he wears it on his armor, and it's like a symbol that a lot of different Mandalorians use. It's this elongated looking skull with tusks. These were enormous dragon-like creatures that some accounts describe them as being as large as a small city. They were these scaly lizard-looking things that had two sharp tusks that curved inwards that they used to fight competitors. They were native to the planet Mandalore, and they lived in the giant Beskar mines beneath the ground where they had the ceremonial living waters. The legendary Mandalore the Great was the first person to defeat a Mythosaur and ride it. And he did this during a time where, you know, blasters were relatively new and expensive, and so he defended his Mythosaur and fought on this thing with these big, heavy swords and axes. And then after this, ancient Mandalorians would fight and tame and ride these things into battle. It was also said that Mandalore the Great was the first person to wear a Mandalorian mask, and that he actually carved that mask out of the sternum or the chest bone of a Mythosaur, and that it was extremely impenetrable. So these Mythosaur became a mascot of the Mandalorians, you know, being the symbol they wore on their armor, but eventually they were driven to extinction, very likely because the Mandalorians were constantly hunting them as a rite of passage to test young warriors. In The Mandalorian Season 3, Episode 2, we see what looks like a living Mythosaur lurking beneath the ceremonial living waters. And I don't know for sure, but I have a good feeling about this upcoming Mandalorian and Grogu movie. I think maybe they're gonna finally show the Mythosaur, not trying to jinx it, but I'm just kind of speculating, but it's like, it has to come about at some point, and I feel like this is probably the best time for it to appear. And so, you know, maybe at the end of the movie, he's going to be riding Mythosaur, and if he does, you heard it from me first. I hope I didn't spoil the movie, but I do think that's going to happen. And I really hope that movie's going to be good. I think it could be. It should be. That's for sure. They need to make something good. I mean, Maul Shadowlord. It's so good. Maul Shadowlord has been incredible. Anyways, moving on. All right, next up we have the Zillo Beast. So this was that creature that was basically the Godzilla of Star Wars. During the Clone Wars, there was this monster that they accidentally discovered on the planet Malastare after the clones dropped this electromagnetic proton bomb that opened up a big hole and woke up this creature that was extremely surprising to the locals there because these creatures were supposed to be long extinct. This thing was very powerful. It looked like a giant reptile snake creature. It was over 300 feet tall. It had 3 arms. One of its arms was just in the center of its back. And it also is known for having extremely heavily plated armor that was invulnerable to explosions, blaster fire, and even lightsabers. This gave the Zillo Beast quite a reputation, so much so that there was even this background lore about how one Zillo Beast that lived out in wild space territory was worshipped as a god. But then in the same story, I think Kylo Ren kills it for some reason. But the story in the Clone Wars about the beast on Malastare goes on about how it ends up getting shot through a chink in its armor, where it gets taken back to the city of Coruscant, where it then breaks out and rampages through the city just like Godzilla. Shortly after, it ends up getting killed by poisonous gas, but there is a theory that Palpatine, who obviously, was a Sith Lord, I don't know why I said that, was figured out by the Zillo beast, and so that's why it wanted to kill Palpatine so bad, is because maybe this thing was like force sensitive and was like, oh my gosh, this thing is so evil. And Palpatine wanted to clone this thing as a weapon for war. But later it actually gets cloned and then escapes from the Tanis base in the Bad Batch show. So I remember fighting this thing in Lego Star Wars The Clone Wars, and it was extremely difficult to defeat. Next up we have the Blurrg. So this is a two-legged reptilian beast that basically just looks like a giant walking mouth. We see this thing in the first episode ever of The Mandalorian, and it kind of is really awkward the way it walks around on just two legs. Apparently, like the cowboy-like people on this planet use it to travel across the unforgiving sand dunes and harsh terrain. It was suited for barren biomes and lived on planets such as Endor, Ryloth, and as we see in The Mandalorian, the planet Arvala 7. These things were used for everything from farming purposes to war transportation, and apparently they ran very fast despite their awkward appearance, even able to compete with many ground transport vehicles in speed. I cannot imagine how rough it would be to ride one of these creatures. Like, if you watch the show, I feel like it would just be so extremely rough. Any creature that only has two legs would not be fun to try to ride like a horse. I mean, as you can see, this creature has a very T-Rex-like body build, where it has these two strong long legs, and then it has little T-Rex arms, but it possesses this large mouth with many sharp teeth. They use this mouth to chew through most materials, including grass and leaves. But this thing is not strictly a herbivore. It's known to eat other animals. Specifically, it said that the males were eaten by the females after the mating process. I guess because they're not needed anymore. I really like this creature because it reminds me of a prehistoric creature from real life called the Erythrosuchus, which was this creature that looks so similar to this. It dominated the early Triassic period, and it looked a lot like the T-Rex, where it had this massive head and mouth on the body of kind of like a crocodile. It was actually the largest land predator on Earth at its time, being 16 feet long. Funny enough, we see the Blurrg first in the Ewoks Battle for Endor movie, where this one Ewok runs up to a Blurrg and lights a fire beneath its foot to startle it and make it run. Brainworm. So there is this arc that we see in the Clone Wars where the clones are taking over the planet Geonosis, and then they secretly get infected with this parasitic worm. This worm is called the Geonosian brainworm, and it is this tiny parasite that hatches from eggs and then finds its way to the nearest host and crawls through their nose and takes over their body. It attacks their cerebrum and then quickly gains full access to the person's entire body, and it even potentially could control an entire society if the circumstances were just right. What's interesting is they could take over people's bodies even after they were dead, so they're basically like zombies. As it turns out, these worms were kind of like the consciousness of the Geonosian queen hive mind, so they were doing her will and possessing people, and so it was like the Geonosian queen was enslaving these people, and they could even accurately behave like the person they possessed, even accessing memories on what to do and what they were doing. But they figured out that these worms' weakness was cold temperatures after Anakin tortured Poggle, which was one of the Geonosian leaders, who had a great name, Poggle. Anyways, this is one of the only zombie-like things in Star Wars other than the Blackwing virus, which I like a lot and we will talk about later, further down in the iceberg. But anyways, that is all the time we have today for this iceberg chart. I'm going to continue with part 2 next Saturday. I will be posting part 2 May 8th so that we could continue this series and finish off this iceberg. I hate to do a part 2, but I just really feel like I've been talking my voice out a lot lately, and this video was going to be extremely long if I didn't do 2 parts. So thank you guys so much for watching and being a Star Wars nerd and being a deranged viewer just like me. If you want to watch part 2, please hit subscribe because you don't want to miss it, and hit that notification bell so that you get reminded when it gets posted. But I will say we have some of the best monsters in this iceberg yet to come, such as, you know, like the Gorax. I love that thing so much. I'm so excited to talk about it. And also like Abeloth and Star Weirds. But thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for 600,000 subscribers. I do not deserve it, but for some reason you guys like watching iceberg charts, and I like making iceberg charts. So it's kind of like it's a win-win situation. You receive iceberg, I receive gratification. If you guys have any specific iceberg charts that you would like me to try and do one day, put that down in the comments. And if you want to be part of like suggesting ideas and voting on what I do next, you can be part of my Instagram group right there, my Instagram like group chat thing. But thank you guys for watching. Thank you for being a deranged viewer, and I will see you guys next Saturday when I do part 2. Goodbye.